The last phases of Old Testament history involve the divided kingdom, when Israel and Judah are two separate entities, the period of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, and then how that Judah was returned from Babylonian captivity to rebuild Jerusalem. These events you can read about in the Old Testament books of 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Into the backdrop of these events are found three mighty kingdoms, actually empires. Seeing how that these empires rotate in and out of the biblical narrative and how these empires interact with the Israelites is a very important part of understanding the closing phases of the Old Testament. First of all, let's talk about what is an empire. An empire rules over multiple regions. It also rules over multiple ethnic groups and cultures, and it's usually acquired by conquest, this rule over these peoples and lands. It's also a combination of governments or states under one umbrella authority. Some of these empires are very centralized, like Assyria and Babylon. Others are more decentralized in their government administration, like Persia. The first of these mighty empires that impact the last events of the Old Testament is the Assyrian Empire. You can see here on the map that the Assyrian Empire is based at the apex of the Fertile Crescent, that arch that goes up from Mesopotamia down through what we know as Palestine in the New Testament into Egypt. Note that Assyria is distinguished from Syria. Earlier in the Old Testament, you read about Syria. Syria is located between Israel and Assyria to the north. And Syria is still located basically in the same place where Syria is found in modern times, though the ethnic makeup of the people is different. But Assyria is located at the apex of that crescent, and Assyria rules and is dominant in this region and beyond from about 824 to 612 BC. Assyria rules up and down the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. That's their stronghold. But also they extend all the way to the plains of what we call Iran today, over into parts of Asia Minor, which we call Turkey today, and down through Israel and Judah and into Egypt. Their chief city was Nineveh. Yes, the city that Jonah was called to go to and to preach there for the people to repent. Why was the Assyrian kingdom so successful? Here are some reasons. First of all, they had a productive agrarian base in that river valley. Also, they had dynamic leaders, and they had strong and advanced military. Their tactics and their weaponry really had the upper hand on those around them. But also, the Assyrians were known for being brutal in war, even terrorizing. Their methods of war were so intimidating. They were the most fierce conquerors of the early ancient world. To give you an example of how fierce they were in battle, here's a quote from King Ashurnasirpal. He says, 3,000 of their combat troops I felled with weapons. Many of the captives taken from them I burned in a fire. Many I took alive. From some of these I cut off their hands to the wrist. From others I cut off their noses, ears, and fingers. I put out the eyes of many of the soldiers. I burned their young men and women to death. I fixed up a pile of corpses in front of the city gate. I flayed the nobles, as many as had rebelled, and spread their skins out on the piles. I flayed many within my land and spread their skins out on the walls. That gives us an idea of how fierce and brutal the Assyrians could be. This intimidating Assyrian force was the instrument that God used to bring down Israel, the northern kingdom. The Assyrians invaded Israel, they subdued the land, they captured Samaria, and then they hauled off the Israelites into captivity and dispersed them throughout their empire holdings. As a result, Israel never again reconstituted as a kingdom. The Assyrians also threatened Judah. They mowed through the countryside and were on the verge of toppling Jerusalem. But then, in the days of Hezekiah, God intervened and protected Judah and protected Jerusalem in particular, and the Assyrians were turned back. As a result, Judah survived, and so did the dynasty, this Assyrian invasion. The next mighty kingdom that enters into the late biblical narrative is what is called the NEO-BABYLONIAN Empire. But this new Babylonian Empire is an extension of the old Babylonian Empire. What was that? Well, Babylon was a city-state. It was a significant city in the lower Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, the area the Greeks later called Mesopotamia, and it was a fortified city that exercised rule over a large territory around it. That's a city-state. But then at a certain point, Babylon became a mega city-state. It became very powerful up and down the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And this early Babylonian kingdom was flourishing before, during, and after the days of Abraham. So this is even early in Old Testament history. And they flexed dominance up and down the valley. However, they were a regional empire. Later in Old Testament history, toward the end of it, Babylon was revitalized. And Babylon returned to dominance all these centuries later and is referred to as the NEO-BABYLONIAN Empire. A new ethnic class began to dominate the government. They were called the Chaldeans. And their dominance was fairly short-lived for these empires. It lasted from 605 to about 539 BC. They toppled Assyria, and they roughly rule over the same area as Assyria, over toward what we know as Iran today, all across the Fertile Crescent and down at least to the borders of Egypt. What of the nature of the rule of the Neo-Babylonian Empire? It was a very centralized government built around their very strong and effective leader, King Nebuchadnezzar. It was an intensely powerful empire, but it was short-lived as far as these other two empires we're looking at in this video. It was Babylon that invaded Judah, allowed for a while the Judean kings to govern themselves, but then took some captives over to Babylon. Later, these Judean kings were resistant of Babylonian rule, and after having difficulty with them, the Babylonians came back with a heavy hammer, and they destroyed Jerusalem and took most of the people captive to Babylon. In Babylon, the people of Judah were able to maintain their identity. They lived near and with one another, and this is when they become known, since they were from Judea, they become known as Jews. From the Tower of Babel incident early in the book of Genesis to the first Babylonian kingdom that's flourishing in the days of Abraham, and then down to the end of the Old Testament and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the empire that invaded Judah and took God's people captive, Babylon is represented in the Old Testament as a human force, a human government, and those who are opposed to God and His people. That's why when you come to the book of Revelation in the New Testament, Babylon is employed symbolically to represent those who are human in their base of power and in their thinking, and those who are opposed to Christ and His people. Lastly, there is the MEDO-PERSIAN Empire. The Medes and Persians were two distinct ethnic classes, but they combined over time to build an empire together. But sometimes we just call this the Persian Empire because the Persians came to dominate it. The extent of their rule was impressive. They were based in the area that we would call today modern-day Iran. It's to be noted that modern Iranians are still ethnically Persian, though they have embraced Shia Islam, and they're not Arab. But the Persian Empire grew in an incredible fashion. They toppled Babylon. They ruled all the way from India to Egypt to Asia Minor and even a little bit into southeastern Europe. They were the largest land empire in history to that point, and will be the largest land empire until the Mongols of the 14th century AD. The duration of their dominance was roughly from about 539 to 330 BC, and that was hastened when Alexander the Great and his Greek/Macedonian force defeated them. However, the Persians had much influence before this window of dates and even after these dates. What kind of rulers were the Persians? Very impressive. They had a policy of benevolent rule, especially under Cyrus the Great. They displayed a lot of respect for local customs and cultures as they came to dominate so many different kinds of people in different regions. And they would allow a lot of local government to administrate policies. They had a group of governors called satraps, who were the important local administrators. It was the Persians under Cyrus that allowed the Jews to return from Babylon back to Judah and to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple under the protection and financing of the Persians. A couple of other notable characteristics of the Persians involves their great technology, especially for finding and utilizing water sources. And in this part of the world, that was vital. They also had an extensive transportation and communication system because of effective roads. This road system and the messengers that worked on this road system created sort of a postal service. And it's Herodotus, the Greek historian later, who wrote this about them. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents them from accomplishing the tasks proposed to them with utmost speed. And you thought that phrase may have originated with the U.S. Postal Service. It didn't. It started with the Persians. No other empire in ancient history was more accomplished than the Persians until the arrival of the Romans much later. Again, it is important to keep in mind that these three mighty empires are in the backdrop to the latter historical sections of the Old Testament. For instance, the empires of Babylon and Persia, they're in the book of Daniel. They're the government forces that Daniel's interacting with. And the Persian Empire is the backdrop to the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. It is so impressive how that the history of the Old Testament is very harmonious with the history of these empires that we have outside the Bible. There is much to learn from non-biblical sources about these empires, but the Bible does provide a unique perspective on these three mighty ancient kingdoms. These empires, according to the biblical perspective, are instruments of God. Assyria was used to punish and take into captive Israel, really to destroy Israel. Babylon is used by God to punish the people of Judah, maintain their entity in captivity, and then the Persians are used by God to return the Israelites back to Judah so that they can continue until New Testament times. All three of these mighty empires were led by impressive and gifted rulers. They had advanced technologies, they had robust economies and mighty militaries. But all three of them eventually faded. They're no more. They were used by God, and then God brought justice to them, and God put them to the side in His providential work. This is illustrated in the following quotes. First of all, from 2 Kings chapter 19, where God's prophet Isaiah is speaking of Assyria and their king, and he says, "Have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of ruins." Daniel says this to the great ruler of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, on the occasion of him having a dream and Daniel coming to interpret that dream about an image and 4 different human kingdoms to come. In Daniel 2, he says to Nebuchadnezzar, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. And Nebuchadnezzar got this point, and he replies to Daniel later on, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings. In reading the last phases of the Old Testament, we see that God lifted up, ruled over, and used for his own purposes these three mighty kingdoms. Indeed, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, they were so impressive, but they do not compare to the rule, the power, and the glory of the true and only Lord of heaven and earth, God Almighty, who rules throughout the Old Testament and for all eternity.